overall topic is a time of crisis and compromise in the United States. And our first subtopic is the issue of slavery. We haven't talked a lot about slavery, and we need to make sure you understand that. So it's the issue of slavery. Now, anybody know where ground zero was as far as the slave trade in the South? And ground zero means what? Where everything happens, yeah. Now, what city in the South was ground zero for slavery, where the slave trade was going crazy? Good guess, but not right. What? New Orleans. Look at that. She started 2018, 1 for 1. That a girl. New Orleans. So in the South, New Orleans was considered ground zero for the slave trade. Now, you think about this. This, you know, what time period are we in? We're like in the 18 what? Yeah, 1840s. In that period of time, the slave trade in the South was worth $2 billion to their economy at that time. I mean, it was a huge deal. Slave trade was huge. Just $2 billion of the Southern economy came from slave trade. Now, to give you an idea, and this sounds kind of crazy that you're selling people, but at that time, a male slave sold for approximately $1,000. That's what you would pay for a male slave. Female slave, $800. And they even would purchase children for $500. Now, did they always come in a family deal? No. And that's probably the saddest thing we'll talk about in the slave trade, is it wasn't a family deal. Okay? Now, you even had free slaves. We've talked about free slaves, right? Especially in the North. Even during this time, it's kind of like it reminds me when I was in college and you bought your textbooks. And then at the end of the semester, you could sell your textbooks back to the bookstore for some money. Well, you never left your textbooks anywhere where anybody could get them the last 2 weeks of the semester, because they'd be kidnapped by somebody and taken to the bookstore and sold, because they didn't know whose book it was, right? Same thing happened with these slaves. They would kidnap these freed slaves, and they would bring them back to New Orleans and resell them. This is big money. This was like selling drugs back in the 1840s, as you might see it today. We have a drug problem now. We had a slave problem then. So they even were kidnapping free slaves back into slavery, returning them to New Orleans, and selling them. Now, they estimated that the population of slaves in the South alone was 4 million. 4 million of the people that lived in the South were slaves. That's a huge population. Now, they had a rule, getting back to splitting up families, they had a rule that it was illegal to separate children from their families if they were under the age of 11. There was a rule or a law. It was illegal in the South, especially Louisiana, to separate children from their families if they were under the age of 11. Unfortunately, it was estimated that more than 50% of all sales made in New Orleans separated Negro families apart. Now, can you imagine that? Seriously, it was witnessed that there was more grief shown when families were torn apart than parents staring in the faces of their dead offspring prior to burial. It was sadder for these parents to see their families torn apart than it would be to bury a child. That's what they estimate. Can you imagine that? I mean, you got 3 children. You love your children whether you're a slave or not. And you go to New Orleans for the slave auction, they sell your husband to one group, they sell the wife to another, and sell the children to 3 different other people. And they're, the children are 5, 6, 7 years old. That's what happened to these people. Just an unbelievable situation. So, to not be sold, what did slaves do that were captured? What did they try to do? They tried to run away. Runaway slaves were very rampant in New Orleans. But many were caught. And if they caught them and brought them back, I'm going to give you 3 examples of the consequences that they faced if caught and brought back after running away. Anybody want to guess what they did to them? Yeah. Beat them would have been a good thing. And they probably did beat them, but I mean, this is worse than beating. What else did they do?
Did they cut their tongues out, or was that just another way of like the beating fish?
You're close. Lots of times they cut their ears off. They wouldn't cut their tongues off. Why? This is a good point that Megan makes. Why wouldn't they cut their tongues off? Or more importantly, wouldn't be able to do what very well? Eat.
So then
Well,
they wouldn't be used.
they ask absolutely. They want them eating and healthy. It's like feeding cattle that you're going to butcher. So they wouldn't, but they cut their ears off to teach them a lesson. I'm not saying they maybe didn't think about that, but that hurts their business to cut their tongues off. But they cut their ears off. What else might you do to keep them from, you know, or to help the runaway situation? What else might you do? Cool. What's the most important thing you have to run? If you hurt this, you can't run. Well, what part especially? Well, you couldn't tear out their ACL because then they couldn't walk at all. But what's an injury in football especially that takes a person out of it? Close, get lower. You're in the right area. What's the most important? Achilles. They would cut their Achilles tendon. They would slash their Achilles tendon. That way they could still function, but couldn't do what very well? Run. Yeah. They would cut their Achilles tendon. And if Andy was my slave and he ran off and somebody captured him, I'd sure as heck want him back, but how would they know they belonged to me? They branded. Very good. You're doing good. So, runaway slaves that were caught and brought back to their owners suffered severe consequences, such as having their ears cut off, their Achilles tendons slashed, and they were branded. Now, if you can believe this, in the South, it was against the law for a Negro to take part in these three normal things of today. Negroes could not do these three things in the South. They couldn't learn to read and write. It was against the law in the South for a Negro to learn to read or write. You believe that? Why would they do that?
Oh, because when we pay them, they would give them a check for a tax, right?
Well, they didn't want to be able to communicate real well because they'd be able to go out on their own, right? So it was against the law to read and write. It was also against the law for Negroes to marry. Couldn't marry. And if you did have children, it was against the law that you name them after yourself. Why? They didn't want two Andrew at home. It's too hard to keep track of. Okay? You couldn't name your children after yourself. Against the law. Now, what might a Negro do to protest the way he's treated as a slave other than run away? But think about it. It's a commodity. What could you do, getting back kind of what Meg said, to hurt your owner? Well, you could hurt yourself, I guess. Not work efficiently because you're not strong enough because you're refusing to eat. A lot of Negro slaves revolted by refusing to eat. What do you think they did to those? Nope. Killed them, heck no, they're worth $1,000. How'd they force them to eat? Opened up their mouth, knocked out their teeth, and fed them through a funnel. That's what they did. I'm not making any of this up. You wonder why black people are hostile? You wonder why in a way they want these statues down, these people that oppressed and slave-ridden their people? I mean, this is coming, now we're getting on the other side of that a little bit. They knocked out their teeth and fed them through a funnel. But they did continue to try to escape, and probably the most famous Negro who escaped slavery was Frederick Douglass. You may have heard of him. Frederick Douglass, and I think he's on your ID sheet. So probably one of the most famous Negroes that ever escaped was Frederick Douglass. Now, he escaped by train. Now, we talked about the possibility, right, of there were free slaves out there. So if a Negro got onto a train, what is the first thing the train's conductor would look at? See if you had a ticket. What would be the second thing he would look at? Identification. If you were a free Negro, you would have some sort of identification. So how in the world did Frederick Douglass get on this train that would carry him to freedom without getting caught? He used someone else's identification, and the train's conductor looked at it, but he didn't look at the picture very carefully, and I am not saying this, I am giving a philosophy. His idea could have been, well, they all look the same, and so he didn't know the difference between this one and this one, so he didn't pay that much attention. And luckily for Douglass, he escaped to New York City in freedom. He escaped to New York City and freedom. And he became the face of the anti-slavery movement, even meeting with United States presidents to try to get them to do something about this slavery movement. So we started to get anti-slavery advocates out there, people that spoke up against slavery. Anybody know probably the most famous woman that did that without looking at your sheet? Harriet Tubman. So Frederick Douglass becomes the face of the anti-slavery movement. He even meets with United States presidents. But Harriet Tubman became one of the most famous women to serve as an anti-slavery advocate. And she created something called the Underground Railroad. She created something called the Underground Railroad. And what she did is she helped people escape slavery. Now you think about the commitment. She had escaped slavery herself. Wouldn't that be enough to be free? You'd have to be, I guess, a slave to understand that. But instead of becoming free and worrying about herself, she commits herself to the risk of being caught again by going back to the South and helping other people escape through her Underground Railroad. And what that was helping slaves escape slavery. Once they ran away, she helped them get to safety. Now it was estimated that she probably saved 60,000 Negroes from slavery, brought them out of slavery. Harriet Tubman, it was estimated that she helped probably 60,000 slaves escape through her Underground Railroad. And they also estimated, because slaves sold for different prices, that it probably cost the South $50 million in lost revenue with what she had done with the Underground Railroad. She was so hated that they put a $40,000 reward on her head. They put a $40,000 reward on her head. Pretty much. Yeah. On your head means dead. No benefit of bringing her home alive. Well, Harriet Tubman ironically dies the same month that a lady by the name of Rosa Parks is born. That'd be an interesting, ironic thing there. Harriet Tubman dies the very same month that Rosa Parks is born. Anybody know who Rosa Parks is? Rosa Parks was the lady in the 1950s who refused to give her seat up on a city bus to a white person and was arrested, that led to Martin Luther King's entrance into the civil rights movement and led to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Rosa Parks.
What year was Rosa Parks born?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. She would have probably been born in early 1900s. So you're trying to put the math together?
Well, I was looking at election 1850.
Well, we'll see. That's a good question. Okay, any questions on that? You ever heard of Nat Turner? Anybody you guys watched the movie The Birth of a Nation? Have anybody watched it? Yeah, that's what this is about. I'm going to tell you about the slave rebellion of Nat Turner, because slaves not only started to try to escape, they decided to revolt. This is kind of an interesting story. Really interesting story. The slave rebellion of Nat Turner. I would warn you by telling you that The Birth of a Nation, which is a movie that came out probably in the last year or so, is a good picture of this, but not horribly accurate. Okay? But it does give you the feel. It'll show you a Negro slave having his teeth knocked out and fed through a funnel, for example. But it's not totally true. Well, in August of 1831, a slave rebellion led by Nat Turner occurred in Southampton County, Virginia. In August of 1831, a slave rebellion led by Nat Turner occurred in Southampton County, Virginia. Again, in August of 1831, a slave rebellion led by Nat Turner occurred in Southampton County, Virginia. Now, during this rebellion that was led by Turner, rebel slaves killed somewhere between 55 and 65 people. So this was a bloody rebellion. So Nat Turner and his rebel slaves killed between 55 and 65 people. This is the highest number of fatalities caused by any slave uprising in the history of the United States. Now, Nat Turner was an interesting character. He lived his whole life in Southampton County, Virginia. He was highly intelligent. And he learned to read and write at a very young age, which was very unusual at the time. So he was a very intelligent young man. He learned how to read and write at a very young age, lived in Southampton County his entire life. And he grew up deeply religious, and was often seen immersed in readings of the Bible. Read the Bible all the time. Very, very religious man, reading the Bible daily. According to history, he frequently had visions, which greatly influenced his life, or dreams. And he envisioned these visions as messages from God. So he often would have visions or dreams or thoughts that he really believed were messages from God, and these dreams or visions that he had greatly influenced his life. Well, at the age of 21, he ran away from his owner, Samuel Turner. At the age of 21, he ran away from his owner, Samuel Turner. But he returned because he was delirious with hunger. He was so hungry, it was better for him to return than continue to be escaped. So at the age of 21, Turner ran away from his owner, Samuel Turner, but he returned a month later after becoming delirious from hunger. Now we're going kind of backwards because in 1831 is when he led the rebellion, right? So we're going to back up a little, okay? Well, when he was back with his owner, he often conducted Baptist services, and he preached the Bible to his fellow slaves, who gave him the name the prophet. So he would very, very enthusiastically conduct Baptist services, preaching the Bible to his fellow slaves, and his fellow slaves, they were all owned by Samuel Turner, dubbed Nat Turner the prophet. Well, in 1830, Joseph Travis purchased Turner and became his master. In 1830, Joseph Travis purchased Nat Turner and became his master. Isn't it weird that you can just purchase people like a car? It just seems odd. But he was purchased in 1830 by Joseph Travis, and Joseph Travis became his master. Now, Turner often recalled that Joseph Travis was a kind master who had placed great confidence in him. Okay? So, according to Nat Turner, Joseph Travis was a kind master. And Joseph Travis had placed a great amount of confidence in Nat Turner. Well, on February 12th of 1831, Nat Turner witnessed a solar eclipse, just like you did earlier in this year, right? He witnessed a solar eclipse. Did they have the science we have now to really know what that meant? Probably not. Well, Turner, in seeing that solar eclipse on February 12th, 1831, was convinced that that was a sign for which he was waiting. And this is when he started to make preparations for the rebellion against white slave owners of Southampton, Virginia. So he witnesses this solar eclipse on February 12th of 1831. He sees it as a sign from God. And he organizes and puts together this rebellion against all white slave owners in Southampton, Virginia. And he enlisted the support of 4 fellow slaves to help carry this out. He enlisted the help of 4 fellow slaves to carry this out. And they planned the rebellion, ironically, for July 4th, 1831. So Nat Turner sees a solar eclipse on February 12th of 1831. He sees it as a sign from God. He prepares a revolution, a rebellion against white slavery.